What did Will Rogers say about land? Buy it because they ain't making any more.
The only indubitable means of improving the position of the workers, which is at the same time in conformity with the will of God, consists in the liberation of the land from its usurpation by the landlords. The most just and practicable scheme, in my opinion, is that of Henry George, known as the single tax system. Leo Tolstoy. By the 1880s, nearly anyone in America would immediately recognize the name Henry George. His fame once rivaled that of Mark Twain and Thomas Edison. Now, his name and legacy are almost completely forgotten. Brilliant but uneducated, Henry George was driven by the social inequalities of his time to not only speak out against them, but to actually offer a solution. He published an immediate bestseller that introduced the world to the single tax plan. According to this plan, no one would be taxed for their labor, but instead, the government's revenue would come from individuals who hold natural opportunities that should belong to the community. By taxing landowners an amount equal to the relative value society places on land, individuals would be free to retain all the benefits of their labor. Then, through a series of political campaigns, George nearly succeeded in implementing the single tax, which would have completely eliminated poverty and curbed the excesses of the most wealthy Americans.
Like a flash, it came over me that there was the reason of advancing poverty with advancing wealth. With the growth of population, land grows in value, and the men who work it must pay more for the privilege.
Still intrigued the number of people I've met that are actually degreed economists who've never heard of Henry George. To go through any kind of economics program and not be aware of who Henry George was and his position in American society is kind of amazing to me. It'd be like kind of, having a Civil War and not mentioning Lincoln. Henry George proposed that we tax the land, we collect the economic rent, we allow land to be used exclusively so that people can keep buildings and keep their crops and so on. But if we collect the rent, then people will only hold the amount of land that they use. The incentive will be to use the least amount of land and to produce as much as you can on it. And by doing that, there will be a lot of land that's still free as an alternative place of employment for labor and for capital, and society will share the economic rent, which manifests itself on the superior opportunities.
When America was entering into that age of limitless potential at the latter half of the 19th century, Henry George could not stand to witness the contradiction of increasing poverty right along the increase of industrialization and national wealth. His concern for poverty began at an unusually early age, and, since his family was both familiar with fortune and bust, securing an education for their son was not a trivial expense. Despite being considered one of the brightest in his class, he was frequently bored with the routines of academics. His mind was elsewhere, and it wasn't long before young Henry was asking permission to travel to India, so that he could witness firsthand the conditions of poverty there that until now he could only read about. A few years after his return, he made his way to San Francisco, broke and unable to find employment as a printer since he failed to complete his apprenticeship in Philadelphia. And he continued to ponder the country's poverty problem, while at the same time dealt with his own. San Francisco was a perfect place to observe the vast differences in wealthy and poor. Droves of fortune seekers were coming to the new city hoping to find the same luck that only a select few had found. His luck did eventually turn, however, and George found an opportunity to finally finish his apprenticeship. It was here where Mr. George's writing career began. While setting the type for the newspaper, he started submitting editorial letters to the same paper he worked for. But he did so anonymously. The editor was frequently including them in the published editions, and George had the privilege of setting the type for his own utterances. It was not long before the editor was seeking after this unknown, brilliant author. When he discovered it was one of his compositors, he quickly pulled him off the presses and put him in the editorial room. It was during this time that George began printing his ideas in articles and pamphlets concerning the land question. With a clear understanding of the cause of poverty itself, he became fully committed to communicating the truths that he believed would forever eliminate poverty.
He was a newspaperman, in essence. He traveled. He went to India and traveled, went west for the gold, the whole 9 yards. But for him, is really, to me, the defining moment for Henry George is when he's talking about, if I remember, he was in San Francisco at the time, married, had kids, and was basically flat broke. And decides to approach someone on the street and ask him for $5. And in his mind is that he realized that if this man did not give him the $5 to feed his family, that he would have taken it by force. And I think that was a defining moment where he understood the state that people can reach when there's this inequity in distribution. There is no option. There is no way to make a living. And I think that set him onto the path of how can it be that in this time of this industrial revolution, with the promise of, great prosperity, better jobs for everyone, better working conditions, this whole concept that there's this wonderful future ahead, how could it be that this occurs and there's still abject poverty? And I think that's what really started driving him to try to come up with a solution. And I think it's intriguing that in the final analysis, and this is the debate whether it's philosophy or economics, I really think he was trying to change society from a social aspect, and his solution becomes an economic one.
His thoughts concerning the poor were always with him while working on the newspaper, but had he continued to be successful in that field, he may have never had the opportunity to compile his brilliant ideas. Eventually, George began publishing his own successful paper. It was so successful that George decided to expand the operation with a loan procured from Nevada Senator John P. Jones. All was working out extremely well until Jones's other investments demanded that George immediately repay his loan. George refused, and the subsequent foreclosure of his newspaper led him to an undemanding position in the governor's office. This, however, led to George having more leisure time, which he committed to compiling all the ideas that consumed his thoughts since traveling to India. These thoughts would eventually become Progress and Poverty. Page after page, George would completely deconstruct the current system of taxation, as well as offer a totally new strategy. He wanted to eliminate poverty in a society where progress and profit were, in effect, limitless. And he recognized that the monopolistic control of natural resources was the thing that stood in the way of making that possible.
How the single tax would end poverty is simply because poverty is a manifestation of low wages and unemployment. So if we could create full employment and raise wages, we feel we could end poverty.
The fundamental principle of human action, the law that is to political economy what the law of gravitation is to physics, is that men seek to gratify their desires with the least exertion. When it has been reduced to private ownership, the increased productivity of labor only increases rent. Thus, all the advantages of progress go to those who own land. Wages do not increase. Wages cannot increase. The more labor produces, the more it must pay for the opportunity to make anything at all. Mere laborers, therefore, have no more interest in progress than Cuban slaves have in higher sugar prices. It may clearly be seen that material progress does not merely fail to relieve poverty, it actually produces it.
He eventually realizes it's this, in essence, the inequity in the distribution of wealth comes from the constant hoarding of land, and the speculation that comes with it causes the cyclical boom and bust in the American society. And I don't think we're any better off now than we've ever been. I don't think we're any closer to an economic solution to the inequity in distribution of wealth and the constant downturn in our economy, these constant booms and busts. We seem to be the same place we've always been, and we're looking back 100, 150 years to Henry George.
George had discovered the cause of inequality, and he knew how to remedy the situation. Equality was all that mattered to George, no matter how it came to be, and no matter whose great fortunes it might disrupt. George's fundamental principle centered on the belief that natural resources, land in his terms, were not eligible for private ownership. This flew square in the face of the American traditions of land grabs and manifest destiny, but he could not see it any other way. Land was a God-given resource, available to all, and no one had the right to claim it for themselves. Furthermore, he didn't have any sympathy for the landowners who might be affected by any kind of redistribution his vision would demand.
The anti-slavery movement in the United States began with talk of compensating owners. But when 4 million slaves were emancipated, the owners got no compensation. To the extent that moving to cheaper land becomes difficult or impossible, workers will be reduced to a bare living, no matter what they produce. Where land is monopolized, they will live as virtual slaves. Despite enormous increase in productive power, wages in the lower and wider layers of industry tend everywhere to the wages of slavery. Owning the land on which people must live is virtually the same as owning the people themselves. Poverty deepens as wealth increases. Wages fall while productivity grows. All because land, the source of all wealth and the field of all labor, is monopolized. Unequal ownership of land causes unequal distribution of wealth. And because unequal ownership of land is inseparable from the recognition of individual property in land, it necessarily follows that there is only one remedy for the unjust distribution of wealth. We must make land common property.
I think a lot of people just didn't get it. And part of it is, of course, the thing was, well, they're going to confiscate your land. In order to do this, they're going to take all your land away, of course, which would scare the hell out of any American. But you don't need to confiscate the land. All you need to do is collect the rent. You're just shifting the tax onto the land and away from the structures. And what I do like about it is you're not penalizing people for their labor. You're not penalizing someone who is paying their full rent for the land and then spending their labor or money, whatever they've done, to improve their lives and improve their home and improve their community. They're not being penalized for doing something good for the community.
I think it would work absolutely perfect today as it would have worked in his day. And perhaps the need for it is all the more there.
Had George stopped short of his plans of implementation, had he simply demanded a socialist agenda of redistribution of land and wealth, he would not have been known outside of San Francisco. But the way he proposed to introduce his economic revelation was nothing short of brilliant.
How shall we do it then? We could simply abolish private titles and declare all land public property. I propose to accomplish the same results in a simpler, easier, and quieter way. Let those who now hold land retain possession. Let them even continue to call it their land. I propose that we appropriate land rent for public use, through taxation. This simple yet effective solution will raise wages, increase the earnings of capital, eliminate poverty, reduce crime, and provide full employment. It will unleash human power and elevate society.
In Progress and Poverty, George clarified three means by which wealth can be gained: labor, capital, or land. Labor yields to workers their wages, capital yields interest for investors, and landowners profit by collecting rent. Under the current system, all means of acquiring wealth are taxed. George thought this was unfair, especially to those who earned barely enough to have basic needs met. There is, however, enough wealth being gained through the control of natural resources to cover what would be provided by both labor and capital. Thus, the single tax. The holders of these natural resources, according to George, have no right to withhold wealth produced from land that should be shared by all.
The single tax, in short, would call upon individuals to contribute to public revenues, not in proportion to what they produce or accumulate, but in proportion to the value of the natural opportunities they hold. It would thus solve the labor problem.
The single tax would have lasting effects. It would free up wasted potential and provide more opportunities while at the same time balance out wealth gained from land. In cities, where valuable plots are held vacant or underdeveloped, a tax on the value of the land, irrespective of property value, but assessed from potential value of the surrounding land, would, in effect, force owners to develop it or release it to more enterprising individuals. The subsequent development would ensure the creation of jobs and discourage low-income housing. In the country, lower land values would set farmers free from high taxes, allowing them to retain all the benefits of their labor. George now held in his hands a manuscript that could potentially transform society, but no one was interested in publishing a book of political economics from an unknown. The few publishers that actually read the manuscript found its proposals too radical to consider. Finally, someone was willing to take the chance, but only agreed to cover the expense for the printing plates. The gamble paid off. Progress and poverty soared in popularity and sales. Societies were formed overnight with the goal of implementing George's ideas. He found himself being swept up into speaking engagements all over the country and as far as England and Scotland. He wrote his book with no intentions of worldwide fame, but the world was hungry for these new ideas. When it came time to progress these ideas on a political level, his followers looked to him to carry the ball forward.
After he publishes Progress and Poverty, he kind of becomes world famous. He gets arrested in England, which, of course, he comes back to New York City, this great American hero in that standpoint, and his book just took off, and I think he just influenced an immense number of people.
In the years leading up to the election, New York City was in the midst of forming a successful third political party centered around the concerns of labor. The United Labor Party nominated George as their choice for mayor of New York City. By no means were all of them single taxers, but this did not matter to George. This was his chance to promote his ideas at the executive level, and to perhaps finally put them into practice. George immediately made the single tax his main platform, and those in the Labor Party that disagreed with this particular emphasis were at least in agreement with the larger picture of winning political control for the rights of workers. Although the Republicans put forth a worthy candidate in Teddy Roosevelt, it was the Democrats' Abram S. Hewitt that stood in the way of seeing the single tax implemented and tested as a viable solution to the poverty problem. The odds were long from the start, as the Labor Party was infringing on the established two-party system. But George held his own. However, in the end, it was not enough. Hewitt received roughly 90,000 votes to win the election. George received 68,000. It was a loss all the same, but it inspired the fledgling party that had beaten Roosevelt and the Republicans by 8,000 votes. It was inspiration enough even for the party to nominate George once again, this time to run for New York Secretary of State. And, once again, seeing another opportunity to promote the single tax, he obliged. This time, the Labor Party did not have Abram Hewitt to stand in their way. This time, the challenge would come from within. A significant portion of the Labor Party sided with more socialist ideas of improving society, and for them, George's reforms did not go far enough. They voiced criticisms of their frontrunner. In the end, the result was disastrous. After the votes were tallied, in New York, George received half of what he got during the mayoral election. The prospect of seeing his single tax theory adopted through the efforts of the Labor Party looked slim. Yet the United Labor Party was still willing to back Henry George in their run for the presidential campaign. George, however, had his doubts. Fearing that most people were now associating the United Labor Party with a socialist movement, he felt it would be more beneficial to back Grover Cleveland in the national contest. Cleveland's new position on free trade doctrine was enough of a step in the right direction in George's mind to rally behind him. This did not go over well with the United Labor Party, George holding firmly to his support of Cleveland, and a hope in being able to preach the single tax doctrine through the Democratic Party was, in effect, excommunicated. Despite receiving his support, the Democrats did not welcome George. Perceiving George as a radical to their platforms, they feared his public support of Cleveland would ferry votes across to the other candidate. In the end, it didn't matter. The United Labor Party failed to even get 0.5% of the vote, and George's hope for advancing the single tax with Cleveland ended when he failed to win the electoral vote. With the president now voted out and the Labor Party nearly disintegrated by internal dissent, George was running out of opportunities to see his ideas become a reality.
I've heard that his funeral cortege was as large as Lincoln's. That many people knew Henry George and were smitten by him, saw as a great American. It's kind of funny he drops off the face of the earth.
George's death did not put an end to the single tax movement. There were many who took up his cause. Land value taxes were collected in other countries, Australia, New Zealand, and Taiwan, to name a few. Towns in America, such as Arden and Delaware, were devoted to maintaining a commitment to George's ideas. But in the century that has passed, his beliefs on equality and fairness in labor have been overshadowed by a Darwinistic attitude to business and trade. Now, Arden is the only single tax community left.
The village was originally founded in 1900. The community was based on the economic theory of Henry George. The reason they ended up in Arden, Delaware, is that in the 1896 there was a single tax campaign to convert Delaware to the single tax. A lot of Georgists thought that if they found a small state and they were able to implement the Georgist economic theory, that the world would see the genius of it and come marching to their door.
In Arden, we don't tax anybody on any of their improvements, which means if you want to build a $100,000 house, the taxes will be no more than if you had a $10,000 house. This has created, I suppose, a lot of jealousy in Arden, where people say a man with a big house and a small lot pays less taxes than a man with a small house and a big lot. And they're saying, hey, this is not right. But as a Georgist, we say, what is the man getting from the community? He's getting a lot of land. Well, he should pay the community for that. Through his own efforts, he's built a big house. Why should he owe other people money for that? Why should he pay a fine for his industry? And to me, it makes all the sense in the world.
But it's the moral issue that gets people hooked. And I think it is both the moral issue and the thought that you really can make a difference in the world.
Most of its residents are unfamiliar with the principles the village was founded on. At each town committee meeting, The possibility of abandoning the land value tax is only a majority vote away.
The majority of the people who live here and have all the political power in their hands have absolutely no knowledge of the single tax, or want to have any knowledge of it, or think it has any serious relevance to the town.
In a time when many are looking for solutions to economic problems, Henry George's ideas are facing extinction.